Okay, hello. I'm Malcolm Beasley, and today I will be presenting my individual author assignment. Yes, my hair is uncombed, and yes, I have an Auburn room, War Eagle. I've had that since third grade. Thank you. Today I'll be talking about a man named William that was born into slavery in Kentucky in 1814. His father was a white man, which as we have seen, is common among that in the time that slave owners and the white men would take advantage of the slave women and create children with them. In his life, he attempted to escape from slavery, and at first he failed, and then was sold to a different master. He was then renamed by his slave master to Sanford because of the master's new nephew, whose name was William. They did not want that confusion or him to go by William as well. And this didn't seem to resonate well with William. He took pride in his name, liked his name, and didn't like that being taken from him. And so a year later, when he did finally successfully escape, he was helped out by a Quaker man by the name of Wells Brown. And when he finally got on his way, he adopted that name as well. And that is why he goes by the man that we know today, William Wells Brown. So after he escaped, very soon after, really, he got a job and got married. He helped other slaves escape. And he just kind of became an anti-slavery lecturer and a reformer and a cultural critic. And right here, it's a nice picture of him. I think that went dead, so sorry about that. But that is kind of probably what he looks like. So the first work we're going to talk about today, it's only like 4 pages, really just excerpt, I think, of this work. But it is the narrative of the life and escape of William Wells Brown. And so, yeah, it's like the narrative. So you're probably already kind of thinking that there's going to be comparisons to Frederick Douglass's narrative, and you're right, and I'll get to that here in a second. One thing I would like to note about his narrative, it's kind of weird. It reads in a third-person point of view. So it's almost like someone else wrote it about him, but it's about himself. But I know there are a few things I took out of it. He's very detailed. He's a very good storyteller, even if it's about himself. He is able to dramatize things very well to get his points across. He just tells a very unique story, very detailed about what he was going through, these trials, and kind of just the setting of the overall plot and what he was doing at each time. So kind of just a basic plot of his narrative, the few pages that we get to read. It's when he escapes. He goes into detail about the hardships of his escape. He realizes he needs help. He's kind of like sick, doesn't have anywhere to go. He's in the woods. He refers to himself as a fugitive, which is kind of weird. He notes that what he has seen like in society, and he makes that well known. He mentions it a few times. But he realizes he needs help, and so he's waiting by the road. A few people pass, and he sees kind of like a pilgrim-looking person, a Quaker, and realizes that if there's anyone he can trust for help, a white man that he can trust for help, it's probably that guy. And luckily it was. So he approached him, was able to get help from him, and experienced hospitality and kindness unlike he ever has, especially from white people, and was able to get help from him. And that is why he adopted the name of William Wells Brown. And it's just kind of a unique love and kindness from Wells Brown to William. So then he eventually left for Canada, but stopped in Cleveland, where he worked for this family. And then the family had 2 kids, and he eventually he found himself in a place where he was free, and he wanted to learn to read and write. And so he starts by bargaining with barley wheat, sugar, with the children to teach him his ABCs. And he really worked hard and strived for this education, and it paid off. As I was saying, he was just a very good storyteller, very, very good with his words. One thing I would like to note, and read a little excerpt from his narrative out to you. It's the comparison to Douglas's narrative. So I mentioned how he got the children to teach him his ABCs. And so on page 936 of our text, I'll read a little bit and then it skips down. But now I said, if you come to me in my room and teach me my ABC, I will give you a whole stick. And then it kind of goes down. He said, we all lay down upon the floor, covered with the same blanket, and first one would teach me a letter, and then the other, and I would pass the barley sugar from one side to the other. So that is very comparative to how Frederick Douglass learned to read and write by being able to learn from those white boys that he found that were willing to teach him. It's also kind of unique if you can kind of envision that picture of kind of a grown man and these two little boys under a blanket together, almost like a sleepover or like a blanket fort type thing. And these little boys are teaching him his ABCs in exchange for pretty much like candy, something sweet to put on their tongue. And so that is the first one, our narrative of William Wells Brown. I'll note also not just Douglas's narrative, not just was that very parallel with his narrative, but them two, both as people. They actually worked together in some respects with their abolitionist movements and anti-slavery lecturing and works. And they were both born into slavery, both kind of have very similar stories, escaped, had both seen the same things, and were on the same side of the of things, so they were able to relate well with one another. Our next work, this is take like 400 because I didn't read this till this morning, but our second work is going to be Clotel, or the President's Daughter. And one thing you should know about William Wells Brown is that he used his works of fiction and storytelling to preach and tell his message about anti-slavery and make points about the social injustice in America. And so I'd first like to read a sentence in his autobiography that is in the book. In his best-known book, the novel Clotel, Brown engaged the ideological contradictions of a nation that celebrated itself as a bastion of Republican freedom, even as it continued to uphold the institution of slavery. So just keep that in mind, that theme, as we go through the plot of Clotel. So it starts and it just kind of spends a page or two talking about the societal roles of the slave versus master, talks about marriage for a little bit, and just talks about the oppression of the slaves. Then there's a big, long advertisement for a group of slaves, and through that you can kind of see the wrongness in it, especially from today's point of view. I mean, it's like an advertisement of something you'd see on TV. Like, I mean, it's selling people. In that advertisement, it advertises a young woman, a daughter of one of the other slaves, who is multiracial, and her name is Clotel. She is seen as superior. And then it also says that she is Thomas Jefferson's daughter, and which that point right there is the whole point of the book. Keep in mind that she is Thomas Jefferson's daughter, and she is being sold into slavery. So they auction these group of slaves off, and she's the last one to go, and she goes for $1,500 to a man named Mr. Green. She is Mr. Green's mistress for a little while. They have a daughter together, and then she is sold south, just tossed around like she's nothing. But later on, she escapes from the south. She goes north, tries to find her daughter, whose name is Mary, and she is captured and imprisoned. And then it goes on for about a page or so and talks about the slave revolts of the time, and talks about just how brutal that was, and how oppressed the slaves were. So she runs away again. And as she is about to be captured again, she kind of commits suicide. She kind of fights for a minute, and then she jumps off a bridge, and she dies. And so I would like to read something from that part where she jumps off the bridge and dies, and kind of what the point that it makes about that. So that happens, and it says, "Thus died Clotel, the daughter of Thomas Jefferson, a president of the United States, a man distinguished as the author of the Declaration of the American Independence, and one of the first statesmen of the country." It goes down to say, "But she was a slave, and therefore out of the pail of their sympathy, they have the tears to shed over Greece and Poland. They have an abundance of sympathy for poor Ireland. They have furnished a ship of war to convey the Hungarian refugees from the Turkish prison to the land of the free and the home of the brave. They boast that America is the cradle of liberty. If it is, I fear they have rocked the child to death." And so it uses this fictional story to make the point that America, which is seen as such a country that prides itself in its liberty, actually has no liberty really at all if the own president's daughter is being tossed and sold like a slave, like an object, not even a person, isn't even treated as a human. And so it uses that story to convey that anti-slavery message. And because of that, this story reminds me of Pilgrim's Progress. And it's kind of weird, but it's because it has a deeper meaning. It's not just a fictional story that you can enjoy and you can see all these fictional elements and stuff that make a good story. It does have that stuff, but it has a deeper meaning, symbolizes different things, has a message to it. And it just, the author had a higher intent than just to tell a story. There's something to gain from reading it. The second comparison is also to the narrative, and I know that's not 3 words. I'm kind of using the narrative twice. The first one was more comparison to Frederick Douglass as an author, but I do think that this most highly compares to the narrative as well. And I say that because of the slave revolts. I guess you could also say it compares to Benito, that story, because of the slave revolts in that, but I more so see it in the narrative because of the role of like slave master and the slave. And I'll read to you from page 945. The inhabitants were too much engaged in putting down the revolt among the slaves, and although all the odds were against the insurgents, the whites found it no easier matter with all their caution. Every day brought news of fresh outbreaks. Without scruple or without pity, the whites massacred all blacks found beyond their owners' plantations. The Negroes, in return, set fire to houses and put those in debt to death who attempted to escape from the flames. Thus carnage was added to carnage. The blood of the whites flowed to avenge the blood of the blacks. These were the ravages of slavery. No graves were dug for the Negroes. Their dead bodies became food for the dogs and the vultures, and their bones, partly calcined by the sun, remained scattered as if to mark the mournful fury of servitude and lust of power. And that's just a sad reality of that time, and how these slaves in that race, how oppressed they were, and how they didn't matter. You know, there were no graves dug for them. They were a possession. They were not people. But those were the two comparisons from that work. He was a good storyteller. And so, yeah. So that's William Wells Brown. And before I finish, he died in 1884. I think. I hope. Forgot to write that. The end.